So one thing I'm going to ask, this is maybe I don't know, kind of writer, author kind of question. One thing I'm really interested in that also I think people who are interested in your books might be interested in is the moments when we're writing and we come to a point that we realize we have to make that maybe hadn't occurred to us until we were like in the process of writing and something jumped out. I wonder if anyone has an example of that, like something, a point or argument you made in the book that just sort of came to you in the process of the writing, something that might be of interest to potential readers, an important or unique argument or insight that made its way into your book.
I can speak to that. One of the things that you know, I write about is how just our very concepts of what literacy is or what it means to be literate are really grounded in white mainstream neurotypical practices. And how can we completely disrupt that and be so much more inclusive in our practice? And one of the things that I started looking into more in kind of reflecting on my own literacy practices growing up and how I was socialized around literacy, around speaking, writing, reading, is that the varies in which my and other sort of white mainstream families ask questions even echoes the way that a lot of questions are asked in a lot of classrooms. They're called known answer questions, where you would say something like, you know, what are the who are the authors of the book that we are reading right now, and what did they say about such and such, where the teacher knows the answer. And in a home environment, that might look like, you know, what do we need to do when we get ready for our bath? And they're not really these questions where we're sincerely asking. And that's just one small example of all of the ways that US public schools especially really echo and privileged white mainstream ways of talking, speaking, writing, listening, reading. And so that was just a really big aha moment for me.
One thing that I noticed, you know, I planned out the book according to common traits of neurodivergent people, students, you know, ideally to sort of flip them on their heads because these traits are used as sort of defense against us. But that I knew, that's not a surprise. I planned that. And then I knew I was going to have to talk a little bit how to take the lessons from the book and apply them to IEPs, because like, not only was I specifically asked to do that, but also someone would come and read the book and say, okay, but I have to do this thing, right? And so I said, I don't want to think about this. I'm just going to write the book first. I wrote all the chapters. And then I said, let me actually go and do what I said I was going to do and look at the IEP stuff. And it turned out that a lot of the answers that the people had given me, the stories they told me, mapped pretty perfectly onto the ways that IEPs, not necessarily, but can be oppressive, right? Like they had said a lot of the things that were in this example IEP that I found from a particular school district or a national organization. And this was a standard, not some supposedly hateful teacher doing this. This was like, here, you should use this as a sample. And so I was like, oh, I had no idea that everything I had been working on and put into the book would actually directly apply to one of the restrictions that I anticipated teachers coming to me with. And so I guess that showed the resonance of what people were saying, but also it showed how much these traits I focused on are used as weapons against us, and how if they read the book and apply the things, they might actually be able to work against what's forced upon them.
I don't know if y'all are like me. Once I write a book, I have a really hard time going back and reading what I've written. Same with the articles. I just feel so awkward. But occasionally when I do, and I'm reading something I wrote, I'll see something, I'll be like, oh yeah, man, I made a really good point there. Has anybody had any of those moments with your book? Like, oh yeah, I really captured that part well.
One thing that I'll say is that we looked at white racial identity development and then thought, well, if predominantly white institutions are made up predominantly of white people, then institutions too can have a white racial identity development. So we really looked at the ways that institutions replicate those stages of behavior. And I think from what I'm hearing from readers and from schools we're working with, that it's been a really useful sort of diagnostic tool. And I remember the moment we had that thought, you know, we were talking about white supremacy culture, how do we want to frame it? And then when we thought about schools having a racial identity, it just sort of fell into place. So I'm still pretty pleased about that.
I'd love to shout out my co-authors who are not here because they wrote some things that I was just like, you are brilliant. I am so lucky to be able to do this with you. In teaching Asian America, my colleague Soyan An has been thinking about the ways that we can talk to young children about war, specifically the Philippine-American War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, all of which are always told from like a U.S. This was a thing that we needed to do for the sake of democracy around the world kind of lens. And I admit to everyone, despite being a scholar of social studies, I do not like history, and I certainly don't like war history. And reading Soyan's description of the Korean War, I was like, that is the first thing I have read about the Korean War that's succinct and makes sense. And thank you for this gift of teaching me something that was always kind of nebulous and confusing to me, but she does it so well. It's beautiful. And then in Social Studies for a Better World, we have a chapter about what we describe as the problematic of dramatization and gamification, because we all know in elementary schools, the reenactment of the first Thanksgiving is just a thing that in some places will never go away. They just love it so much. And Katie just went all in on that chapter and just does a beautiful job. Katie, I think, makes me such a better scholar because she's able to step back and really kind of look at the big picture and like categorize things. And she loves like a diagram. And my brain just doesn't work that way. And so when we were thinking through what would go in that chapter, she started doodling a flow chart, which we ended up putting in the book. And then it kind of walks you through, should I turn this into a game or dramatization, and a bunch of decision-making points. And then in the chapter, she writes out kind of at each point some of the different things that you should consider. And I just think it's so clear and concise and easy for people to be like, okay, yeah, no, I'm going to work my way through this and make some decisions. And so I think that was one chapter that she took the lead on, and with the flowchart where I was like, your brain is beautiful. I don't understand how it works, but it is so helpful. And I think those two particular pieces of those two books were the ones where I was like, my God, my friends are so smart. So I just wanted to highlight this.
Well, I'll say, having written with Katie, another thing she's really good at is metaphors, like using a metaphor to capture something. And I'm bad with metaphors. So she would come with this metaphor and be like, yeah, that makes this make a lot more sense. Yeah.